So I'm going to begin by introducing our speaker, who we very much appreciate being here with us this evening. This is Dr. Chuck Romig. I'll tell you just a little bit about him. Dr. Romig served on the faculty of the Counselor Education Graduate Program at John Brown University from 2008 until his retirement in July of 2020. Prior to joining JBU, he served as a faculty member in the Counselor Education Program at Wichita State University for 23 years, where he attained the rank of tenured professor. He earned his bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Illinois, a master's in pastoral psychology and counseling from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and a PhD in marriage and family therapy from Purdue University. In recent years, he made presentations at the national conferences of the Christian Association for Psychological Studies and the American Association for Christian Counseling. Chuck and his wife, Kim, who's here this evening, thank you for being here, they've been married for 44 years. They have 2 sons and 5 grandchildren. Besides being grandparents, they enjoy the natural beauty of God's creation by hiking, biking, and kayaking. Both are avid readers. After retirement, they relocated to McKinney to be near family, so they live right here in McKinney. Now, before Dr. Romig gets started, I want to point something out to you. You have a stack of index cards on your table, and you have pens. What I would encourage you to do is, as questions come to your mind, please write those questions on these index cards, because we are going to have an opportunity when Dr. Romig has finished his presentation to ask him these questions. And I'll give you a couple of minutes when he's finished as well to write down any additional questions you might think of. So in the past, when we've done this, we have had some really good questions. If you have a question and you're thinking, that's just that whole saying about there's no such thing as a dumb question, especially at something like this, because the question you have, somebody else might really benefit from the answer, so keep that in mind. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Romig.
Before I get started, I noticed this feels really strange to me. And I realized this is the first time since way back in about March of 2020 that I've actually taught or presented in front of people face to face. You know, when I was in my last year at John Brown University and knew I was retiring in July of 2020, it was on my professional bucket list to retire without ever having taught online. Online works, but I'm just not a fan of it, especially when you're trying to train mental health professionals. I'd rather work with you face to face, and I'm old school. But of course, COVID hit that semester in March of 2020. JBU had to send all our undergraduates home and move everything to online. So half of that spring semester was, of course, via Zoom, which we weren't prepared for in a lot of ways. So that was a big experiment for JBU and for all universities. Well, not all, but because some had been doing online for years. And then I had to teach 2 courses in summer school to fulfill my contract totally online. And so I did it, it works, but this is strange. I've done a little bit of guest lecturing since retired, all via Zoom. So it's kind of nice to be back to face, but it actually feels a little strange. So bear with me. Now, I want to start with just a little bit of background more about me. I realized that in the 48 years of my life since I graduated from high school, so I say my adult life, if we can say finishing high school makes you an adult, age 18, 44 of those 48 years I have been full-time in a university context, either as a full-time student or a full-time professor. Now, what that means is that I love the university world and academia, and it's the world of ideas. As I like to say, part of what I liked about it is you're expected, you're required, and you're paid to be constantly learning. At least that's what good professors do, to keep up to date on things in your profession. And you get paid to do that, as well as how to share that with others. But I also came to believe that in a lot of disciplines in universities, professors are really, really good at theorizing and really, really good at coming up with grand ideas that make sense, but in the real world might not have a lot of application or could even be useless. And in my profession, I think it's one that tends to do that. There's a lot of great ideas about how to do counseling, but do they really work? And so there's a part of me that enjoys that, but my goal is to do the harder work as a professor and now as a professor emeritus is, how do you make ideas useful? How do you make them something you can do something productive with? And that's a lot harder for a lot of academic people. Fortunately, I spent the first 10 years of life on a farm. And then every summer of my adolescence after we left the farm, I worked for farmers. And so one of the things you learn in farm life is how to use common sense and practicality to solve problems. And so that, I think, actually helped me be a better professor. You know, we can theorize all you want, but you're going to be sitting down with a client who wants something helpful. So what can I do to help you be helpful to them? In fact, I learned on the farm through my dad that with a good pair of pliers, some good strong wire, and creativity, you can fix a lot of problems. So it's my hope that I will say something tonight that might be useful to each one of you, okay? And I say might because you might have specific things you're wanting answers to that somehow the direction I go just may not be a good fit. That's my goal, is to say things where everybody gets something that could be useful, okay? And that's optimistic. So, what you're going to hear from me, it may not be particularly new, but may simply serve as reminders of things you already know, and how can I do what I'm already doing well with whatever the issues are that brought me here, and do them even better. A lot of education really is redundancy and re-emphasizing what you already know and how to use it better. But I also think I may present some new ideas to you. And I want to start as a ground rule, a couple of things. If you have a clarification question now, if something isn't clear, then that's a good time to interrupt. Say, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're saying or what you mean when you say that. That's a good kind of question. That you don't have to save writing down. Just get my attention. If I need to define what I mean, let's do that right then, okay? All right? So I want to start, and I've also you should have a handout now, and one side of that is the professor side of me, which was where I'm going to start, and the other side is the old farm boy problem-solving application side, okay? So let's start with the professor side, okay? And actually, before we get into this, let me just say a word of prayer for us, if I may, okay? Lord, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all our thoughts and hearts be pleasing to you and helpful in living well, living a flourishing life, a life that's honoring to you. In your name we pray. Amen. I'm a big believer in complexity, and I think it's very biblical. Two of the scripture texts that I think really illustrate this is Psalm 139, verse 14. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, I know that full well. We, as created beings in God's image, we are fearfully and wonderfully made. Second verse related to this is Psalm 8, verses 3 through 6. When I look at the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you've set in place, what is man that you're mindful of him, the son of man that you care for him? Yet you made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You've given him dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under his feet. We are important creatures. God made us a little lower than the angels, and we're fearfully and wonderfully made. Now, what that translated to as a professor is we're complex beings. So even a very specific topic like depression, we're complex beings, and that means depression is a complex subject. One of my pet peeves over the years is I don't like to see human beings and human beings' struggles, our struggles, oversimplified. And I've seen over and over the years fads in the counseling profession that quickly oversimplify how we understand people, how we understand human flourishing, how we understand human problems, and then come up with oversimplified explanations and oversimplified solutions that may completely miss the mark. And I could run through a whole litany from early in my career to the most current overdiagnosed labels that are out there that counselors are using, and I just don't have a lot of patience for that. So just one quick example, and I've heard this my entire career. Children's misbehavior. One of the most common explanations is it's attention-seeking behavior. Yes, it can be. But there are lots of other reasons why children may be misbehaving and struggling. There's one specific theory that's built on that idea, actually a couple of them. But I would ask my students when they would say that, or if I was consulting on a case, okay, but let's say that's true, but whose attention are they seeking and why? Let's figure this out. Or when it comes to depression, I could give a client a Beck depression inventory or some other assessment and come up with a score and chart it and say, here's where you fit in compared to your score, compared to other people's score who've taken this assessment. And it'll give me a sense of how serious your depression is, but it doesn't tell me anything of what it's like to live with that day to day. What's it like to get up in the morning and begin to experience that and living it through the day? How does it impact your life? And see, that's where complexity begins to come in. But it's too easy in my profession to want to reduce people to a label or a number or where they fit on a chart and completely miss how they live their life with whatever it is they're struggling, in this case, depression. So that's why I gave you this. And your reaction should be something like, what? What do I do with this? And if that's your reaction, I say, good. This is something I took about 10 years to develop. In studying the issue of emotion. And what I call this is the complex process of an emotional experience. I got really interested in this because I tend to take, as a counselor, kind of what would be a more, people might call a cognitive therapy approach. How your thinking affects your emotions, how your thinking affects your actions. And that's a very good and very prominently, widely used approach to dealing with emotional regulation issues, whether it's anger or anxiety or depression. But it's not the only effective one. And if you're familiar with CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, you'll see pieces of that in here. But then over a 10-year period, I kept studying more and more theories in the science of emotion and figured out that whenever you have an emotional experience, somehow all the pieces that you see in here are operating to some degree or another. And so the question is, like, I did a lot of work with anger management issues, whether it was counseling people with anger issues where it gets out of control and then their behavior gets out of control and they get in trouble with what they do with it. I did a lot of consulting with schools on how to teach children anger management skills because that seemed to be an issue. And so my mind just went blank. Sorry, you have to get used to that. It'll come back to me. It'll come back to me. This is one of those aging things you just have to sort of get used to that I finally have accepted, and there's usually about a 20-second lag before my thought comes back to me, and I hate it, but it's the reality. But I did a lot of work with that piece of it and that cognitive approach, but depending on how, see, it came back to me, depending on how a particular person was experiencing anger and expressing it, your interventions, you could what piece of this is the most important part to focus on trying to produce change? Because one of the most common ways to mishandle a problem is to focus on the wrong part of the problem. And that's true in the counseling field, anywhere else. So, people say, well, how do I get my anger under control? I say, well, it depends. We need to really examine. Let's look at what your anger problem looks like and figure out where in this kind of set of processes, where does the problem really lie, and what's the short-term solution, and then are there some more long-term interventions that could be helpful too. So this is the professor piece of me, just saying whether it's anger or depression or anxiety, whatever the emotion is, all these pieces are involved. Emotional experience is a complicated process. And even this does not incorporate the most recent neuroscience, where you're getting way down into the limbic part of the brain and how neurons are firing together. And if the brain stem below the limbic brain is somehow dysregulated, which it can be, how that affects and works upward in the brain, and how the thinking process up here, the more cognitive part, impacts the lower part. But it's all interconnected. Okay? So this doesn't even incorporate the latest, greatest neuroscience, which a lot of that part of what we know about the science of emotion is about 10 to 15 years old. So we've got a lot to learn about how the brain functions when it comes to emotion. And in some ways, we're very much at the beginning part of that science. If I were to start my career over again, I'd probably have to spend a lot of time studying the neuroscience. And then you notice there's nothing overtly religious or spiritual here. How does God fit into this equation? But clearly, God does in some way. Okay? So even if you look at this, the complexity of this diagram, and I'm going to describe certain pieces of this as we get to the more practical element, it's still incomplete. But I'm showing you this because it's something I wanted my students to know. I wanted them to know, don't oversimplify emotional experience. And there's a tendency to do that in graduate programs because you want quick fixes to help clients get better quickly. And I know that because that's the kind of therapist. I'm a brief therapist. I want to see quick results. I was trained to think that way. Okay? So I wanted you to see that emotion involves all of this. And which piece matters the most dictates where you start and may only focus your intervention. And get that emotion better regulated. You're going to hear me using that term a lot, emotional regulation. That's how we talk about it when it comes to raising children and school counseling and counseling children and things like that. But what matters most and where do we intervene first, and then how broadly? Are there other ways we need to intervene and not one solution only, not one intervention only? Okay? Then a second piece that I wanted to show you is, and this is on your handout, is this just is, we're all sort of have, if we're thinking of emotion and any given emotion, sort of, I call it our emotional thermostat. And how do we typically have that set? I use the metaphor of on your whatever vehicle you drive, somehow it's set to idle at a certain speed. That when you're sitting and you're not have your foot on the accelerator, it's running at a certain number of RPMs. And it's not supposed to drop below a certain level or your car engine might shut off. Or it's not supposed to rev up too high or it's wasting fuel. And it probably indicates a problem. So it's functioning in some kind of a range. Well, that's kind of where we function emotionally. It's sort of, what's my comfort zone for a particular emotion? Sort of, how excited or how mellow am I? And if I drop below that threshold, if I'm getting too mellowed out, and do I need to sort of get energized? If I get too high out of that, how do I calm myself down? Because most of the time we stay in that kind of a range. And one of the things we need to do to learn how to manage emotions well, if you're struggling with emotion, is to be able to sense when it's dropping too low or too high, and then know how to bring it back into this range where you tend to function best. You work best and get things done. okay? And so this is something else that neuroscience is really focusing on, and how this interacts the entire body here, such as how your heart rate gets involved and your breathing rate, and things like that are impacted whether you drop below your comfort zone threshold or above the comfort zone threshold. But I hope you noticed that I just said, where does the body fit into this? Because in any emotion, the body's involved. So I'm going to come back to that in some way, but knowing kind of where we function most comfortably emotionally, that's our energy level, or whatever you want to call it, and being able to self-monitor and self-awareness helps us to better manage or better regulate our emotions. If you've ever studied the emotional intelligence theory or ideas of I think it's Daniel Goleman, I think his first name's Daniel, he got very popular in the mid-90s and still is. He says, the first key to being an emotionally intelligent person is knowing your emotions, knowing what they are. And your body is a good clue that tells you, I'm either spiraling down into, say, a sadness and depression. I'm noticing that. How am I noticing that? Or something like, say, anger. I'm really getting revved up here. And I don't want to get out of control. But your body gives you a lot of cues there. So that's back to here. We are embodied creatures, and our body tells us a lot about what's going on with us emotionally. So self-awareness is really key to being able to manage your emotions well. Now, I want to clue on one more word, and then I think it's one more, and then we're going to start, then we'll start to get practical. This part down here gets to what I call deeper level stuff. The parts of who we are, some people might say this is where we're getting into our basic personality and personality types, whether it's our core beliefs about how I see myself, like I'm a capable person or I'm a failure person, how you look at yourself, and then we call that self-concept, and then how do you feel about that picture of yourself? That's part of what schema is about. It's also how you view other people. It's also how you view life and the world in general. Those three general categories of core beliefs. Then along with that, you have a basic emotional or affective mood state, which these are just sort of not tied to any specific event, but they're just ongoing emotional states where when it says salient, it's like, I don't know where this came from, but all of a sudden I have this feeling. And there's no obvious trigger. And an ongoing kind of an emotional mood state, regardless of what's happening around you. And that's harder to be aware of and monitor. And it does affect the way we think about things. So I like to use the example of the extreme, a schema about life. Is life generally good or not so good? Sort of optimism, pessimism. On one extreme, you got the Debbie Downers of life, who somehow can make everything look negative. You remember Debbie Downer from Saturday Night Live? I don't know how long ago that was, so when I used to talk to my students, they're like, who are you talking about? I mentioned Robert Redford one time, and I got blank stares from people. I'm like, who's he? Classic movies, Turner Movie Network. I just distracted myself, sorry. But our basic views of life are where we fall on optimism, pessimism. So we got the Debbie Downer on one extreme, or what I call the Buddy the Elf on the other extreme. And where do you fall in there? And those are examples of ongoing moods. But they have certain ways of how you think about the world that are tied to them, that kind of justify why you tend to be more of a Debbie Downer or why you tend to be more of a Buddy Elf. And then along with that emotional state, tending to be more optimistic and feeling good, or more pessimistic and feeling bad, and how you think about your beliefs about life and that are tied into that emotional state, then you tend to act out and behave consistently with that way of thinking and with that mood state. And then one other element of this with moods is when we're in more down moods, we tend to notice more things like bad news. We clue into that more and ignore good news. Or we tend to notice more our failures and struggles if we're more of a Debbie Downer and not notice the things we do well. Our general moods actually affect our thinking. All this is interconnected is my point. All of it's interconnected back to that diagram. And so when we talk about depression, people are put on antidepressants oftentimes just for the purpose of elevating their mood. Because by elevating their mood, they tend to have more positive thinking. They engage in more positive behavior that's pleasurable and self-reinforcing, and their whole emotional state begins to lift. They talk about mood-elevating drugs. And when they work, that's part of what they're doing. It should also impact your thinking process, and you start doing things that are more rewarding that becomes a sort of a feedback loop. Doing the stuff you find pleasurable. It's all interconnected. And of course, your body is clearly affected by your moods. So this is where being embodied creatures make a difference. We cannot ignore the human body and how it affects our mood states. So now I'm going to shift and start getting a little bit practical with this, tying into certain pieces of this diagram, and zeroing in with some basic ideas of where you might intervene that might be helpful to you or to someone in your life that could use some help or energy, some help with something like depression or some other emotion. But I'll pause and catch my breath for a moment and take a drink. So this is a good time for any kind of clarification questions or just an observation you might have. No? Well, say yes.
The Debbie Downer and the elf guy.
Buddy the Elf.
Yeah. I guess I'm observing from what you're saying that I'm kind of in the middle, because if I'm talking to someone who is being a Debbie Downer, I gravitate towards a positive response. Mm-hmm. But when somebody is being too positive, I gravitate towards a negative response. Mm-hmm. Just an observation.
So what am I understanding? So you sort of play off of what they're giving you, but you tend to move a little bit the other direction?
In my thought process, mm-hmm. if you're giving me a negative response, then in my thought process, I'm thinking, okay, but let me help you see the positive side of it. Mm-hmm. And then if somebody gives me a positive side, okay, calm down, let me tell you what the negative thing is. I don't know, maybe it's a sense of obligation to balance or I don't know. That's where it ends.
It sounds like that's what you're trying to do, is to provide some balance to whatever perspective they're giving. That's what it sounds like, but I don't know. I don't know you, so yeah. It's kind of a natural tendency to do that. I'll just say on that whole Debbie Downer, Buddy the Elf, there's been debates my entire career on which is it better to be. To look on the bright side all the time or to take more of a pessimistic perspective on things. Some people call it defensive pessimism. And that's a debate that's been going on a long, long time. Right now you hear a lot about trauma and the impact of trauma and trauma memories that you may not even know you have. And that's been very prominent for at least 10 years, but now there's some pushback coming and saying, well, let's start talking about resiliency and strength again. And there was a period of time where that pendulum kind of was more the direction of the positive psychology and resiliency. And it's almost like that professionally in the discipline doing a little bit of what you're describing. If the fields move too much into brokenness and trauma, well, let's bring back the strength, resiliency, and try to be more optimistic about people. I'm a strong believer myself in the self-healing capabilities that God has given us emotionally. Because our human bodies, when it comes to dealing with illnesses, are programmed to be self-healing and generally do a good job. But even that's broken. Autoimmune disorders is when your own self-healing mechanisms start attacking your body. And we can do that emotionally. So I tend to be, as a counselor, more on the kind of let's find strengths and build on them, but let's not ignore the struggles and the brokenness. And if that's where we need to focus, we will. But if you ever look for a counselor, you probably ought to find out, do you tend to be more the optimistic or not? How do you view human beings? The strengths, resiliency, or focus more on the struggle and the brokenness side? And you need to shop well for a counselor if you ever look for one. Okay, well, let's move on because I want to make sure there is plenty of time for Q&A. So let's get practical. This is the other side of the sheet. Notice I say start with your body. And earlier I said when it comes to managing or regulating emotions, how do you know when your emotions are starting to get a little bit either too high or too low? And the body gives a lot of good clues about this. But also, your body affects your mood states profoundly, and your emotional mood states, as I said, affects how you think and how you cope with life and the kinds of behaviors that you choose to engage in. Even affects probably the kind of life goals you set, how high or low your goals are, your mood states. And so one thing about an emotion like depression is check your physical health. I used to quote, and I can't remember his name anymore, so I simply say there was a psychiatrist at Harvard who's still there, focused on wellness in treating depression, and he said his view was, before I will ever prescribe antidepressants, I want to make sure I want to know their diet, and if their diet's not healthy, let's make sure they're on a healthy diet. Let's make sure they've got enough exercise, because when you tend to get depressed, you get more sedentary, and that has all kinds of physical and then emotional consequences. And then I put sleep on there, not just because psychiatrists, but oddly enough, I shouldn't say oddly, but I was diagnosed about 6 months ago with sleep apnea. I never really knew anything about it, except I had a brother who had sleep apnea, and a cardiologist referred me for a sleep study. And I found out I have severe sleep apnea, and it's like, you want to know why you get up in the morning and you don't feel rested and you're tired so much during the day? You're not getting good sleep. So, basic physical health. So, one simple step as an antidote is get regular wellness exams. And do your own study. There's so much good information online. And if your primary care physician isn't checking out certain things that could be affecting your health, then ask for, could you do this blood test? Like, I don't know whether you've had your vitamin D checked lately, but that seems to really help as an antidote to get through or to avoid COVID. I may have said something I shouldn't have said there, so this might not get put on Facebook or somewhere. But, what kinds of things affect your physical health? And I would never have thought that I had sleep apnea and that was affecting me the way it did. But I was seeing a cardiologist for a completely different issue, and he said, you need to do a sleep study. And it has changed the 6 months then as my sleep has gotten better. I'd like to believe other things have gotten better about my life. My wife can tell you about that. But check your physical health, learn to know your body, and how do you watch for clues? Okay? I used to actually consult a little bit with high school coaches on teaching their athletes in really rough and tough sports like football on how their athletes can self-monitor so they can be energized enough to play well, but not so energized that they start doing stupid things that cause penalties or get them thrown out of games. And self-monitoring, okay? And some people need help with that. So if you have trouble monitoring yourself, then who are the trusted people in your life that can help you with that? Who are the people you're willing to listen to that say, you don't seem to be getting enough sleep, or, you might want to check your diet, or, you're getting a little sedentary or something. Regular wellness exams, self-study, study your own body, Learn the things that as you go through various life phases are going to affect your moods. As you age, you better be having your thyroid checked regularly. You know, a low-functioning thyroid gland leads to less energy, I think I got that right, and can make you start feeling and acting depressed. And as you age, certain things like that, testosterone levels for men. And if you start experiencing low levels of testosterone, you're probably going to start feeling more of a mood of depression. So this is simply saying, watch your body and learn about how your body changes over time and what can impact those changes so that you can get the proper medical interventions to keep your mood within that sort of sweet spot on that graph as best you can. So a lot of dealing with emotional regulation, and I think depression in particular, is know your body. And know what's affecting your body that can affect your mood. Okay? This is where I tended to focus the most as a therapist and in training therapist. This is the cognitive piece. What's on your mind? Know your thoughts. Now back to the diagram, what are your expectations? What is it you're wanting? Because if you want something really badly, like a goal, if you're moving towards that goal and accomplishing it, you're going to feel pretty good about yourself and about life. But if things are interfering with accomplishing that goal, there's a good chance you're going to start feeling something like anxiety, or maybe some sadness and depression, or even anger. Your expectations. And what can get us in trouble sometimes is we set expectations too high that can't get met, so that gap creates a negative emotion state. Or sometimes we set our expectations too low, and so we're not getting enough reward out of what we're doing in life, enough sense of satisfaction, enough sense that we're doing something important and fulfilling. So part of our thinking process has to do with our goals and expectations. Okay? Notice I put in here, what do I want for the holidays? That's because originally, remember, this was going to be done right after Thanksgiving and going into the Christmas season. But what is it I want for specific things, whether it's a season of the year, you know, Valentine's Day coming up, what are your expectations? How do my current life circumstances affect my ways of thinking and expectations? We're going through a season now in our country and worldwide because of COVID where people are having to rethink a lot of things about life. And I think that's creating a lot of anxiety in people and in some cases depression. But current life circumstances, as you go through a normal developmental process, I think particularly when you hit midlife, you have to start rethinking your expectations and what kinds of goals you can meet that maybe at age 22 you were hoping to accomplish, but you realize now you're probably not. How do you reset significant goals in life and expectations? And that can involve a certain amount of grief. Anytime we experience a significant loss, we have to change our expectations. And a natural emotional response is a sense of grief. And grief and depression look a lot alike. And so it's real important for counselors to sort out, is this sort of an extended grief struggle, or is it really moving into a kind of a depression? But that has to do with expectations and how those change. And then schema are their general ways of looking at the world. And I'm going to show a different slide to illustrate that. But the antidote is, what if we're ruminating, thinking over and over negative thoughts? The more you ruminate on what's not going well in your life, or the unfairness of things, or the things you've had to sacrifice or give up, the greater the likelihood you're going to have an increased negative emotional experience. One of the things I know about people that struggle to manage their anger is they have a real tendency to ruminate on how people mistreat them and the unfairness of it. And they ruminate, they say it over and over, negative thinking, and it takes what I call, like, say, on a scale of 1 to 10, a level 2 or 3 anger, and it escalates it because of what you're saying in your head or your self-talk to an 8 or 9, and it's a whole lot harder to control a level 8 or 9 anger than a level 2. And so we can escalate negative emotions by ruminating on negative thoughts. Okay? So this is a cognitive piece. And then we learn to challenge those negative thoughts. You know, is there something about that way of thinking that's faulty? Like, is there another way to look at this situation than the way I'm looking at it right now? Is there an alternative way? Learn to challenge it, and when appropriate, substitute a positive thought. We learned that children 4 and 5 can learn a simple procedure called stop, think, act. I worked with preschoolers at different points in my career, and a lot of preschoolers could learn that. Before you act, stop and think. Then you can act in ways that are going to be more appropriate and more positive as far as the benefit to you and others. This is the cognitive piece. What am I thinking? Is my way of thinking, is it helping me or is it making things worse? And ruminating on negative thoughts tends to make things worse by escalating emotions. Okay? I put this diagram up because these are core beliefs. I don't know whether you can read this, but this represents a person who has a basic belief about themselves that I'm basically an incompetent person and a failure. Okay? The failure identity, some people might say. Now, what this diagram seeks to show, the way it's drawn, is these boxes are, when a person has that kind of a deep negative thought about themselves, they're going to really clue in and notice. So up here it says, I had trouble at work with my computer skills. And of course that just shows how incompetent I am. I really notice my mistakes, my errors, my failures. Another one, I have difficulty applying for a loan. Okay? So really noticing that. And then down here, and those tend to get in and reinforce that self-belief, core belief of I'm incompetent. Down here, the triangles are positive things that I did that don't even get noticed because they're so contrary to this view I'm incompetent. Well, I paid my bills on time, but I don't even notice that as a strength, as a capability. Or I fixed a plumbing problem in my home, but I'm basically an incompetent person, so I don't even notice the things I do successfully. But then it actually gets a little bit more twisted. Notice the triangle here says, I got praise from my boss. Well, see, typically I would ignore that, but I can't ignore the fact I was told that, I was heard that by my boss, so I somehow retranslate it into a negative, and then it actually ends up reinforcing that core belief of I'm incompetent. Yeah, I got praise from my boss, but I really didn't deserve it because. And see how twisted it gets, that something obviously successful and positive feedback can get twisted in a way to reinforce a negative core belief. So for some people, their struggles with depression is because they've got certain basic core beliefs like I'm incompetent, I'm unlovable, I'm a failure, and people can't be trusted, they're not nice, they're going to hurt you, and life is just miserable, and then you die. And you put together a whole bunch of core beliefs like that, how can you possibly see the good in life? And if you're ruminating on those kind of core beliefs and only noticing the events that reinforce those kinds of core beliefs, you're actually taking your depression and you're making it spiral even further downward. Okay? Now, I don't consider myself a specialist in treating depression, but when I did treat people who were struggling with some pretty serious depression, I found that was very common. Negative core beliefs of how I see myself, negative core beliefs about other people, negative core beliefs about life in general, and then how it shapes their thinking where they cannot even see the positive things that are going on in their life, or if they do, they have this weird, unusual way of qualifying them to make it actually reinforce those negative core beliefs. This is a different level of intervention. This takes more time to identify and change core beliefs. it can be done. Okay? But this is the kind of counseling that's not going to be done very quickly. But when it's done successfully, it's like helping people get a completely different perspective on life. Okay? So that's why I put schema, because this is where you get into what you might call aspects of a person's personality. I'm going to speed this up a little bit so we can get to Q&A. Relationships are important. That's why I became a marriage and family therapist and focused on relationship dynamics. And they have a profound effect on how we see ourselves and how we see life. And so know who are your encouragers and who are not. So we tend to withdraw and isolate when we're experiencing depression. We pull away from activities and things that make us feel good and make us feel positive about life and about ourselves. And toxic relationships can really reinforce emotions like anxiety and depression and anger. So the antidote is to find out who are the people in my life that really offer encouragement, that I believe them when they offer encouragement, okay? That can truly say things that matter, that when they say them to encourage me, that I will believe them and that actually works. Who are those people? Who are the people in your life that are the encouragers? Who are the people that I can be an encourager to? And am I willing to reach out to them when I sense myself kind of spiraling into a negative emotion? You know, am I willing to do that? That's a choice. Okay, that can take some humility to reach out. So I think it's key to know who are the people in your life that actually contribute to discouragement and make it harder to deal with personal struggles. That's what I mean as one aspect of toxic relationships. And who are the people that are encouragers? And if I don't have encouragers, then I need to find them. This is where support groups like what you do for each other are really, really important. Support systems. There are certain kinds of struggles in life that it's very clear that part of the counseling process to be successful means finding healthy, encouraging relationships, and support groups can be a really important part of that. That's particularly true in trying to recover from any kind of addiction. If you're not involved in a support group to get you through the particularly difficult times, there's a good chance you're going to relapse. So relationships are important, and you can't read this, but I'll just tell you what it is. It's called the safety plan. And it's designed for people who are struggling with suicide. But I think it applies to more than just suicide. So part of it is, what are the warning signs? How can I self-monitor my moods, my experiences to know? What are the key things as I study my experience of, say, depression? What are the kinds of situations and what are the body cues and other things that tell me, uh-oh, I'm starting to spiral down? That's a self-awareness issue. Then secondly, what are my inner coping strategies? What can I say to myself? What can I do physically that helps stop that spiraling process, or at least slows it down so that I have time to then do some other things to bring myself out? Okay, that's what can I do? Then the third point here is, who are the people I can turn to? Who are the encouragers when I need encouragement right now? Okay, and this is a sheet with a client, you'd fill this out. So they actually have something they can take with them out of a counseling session, okay, and complete it with them. And then if I need professional help, who are the people I can call? Okay, so if you have some professional people in your life, maybe you're already seeing a counselor, you'd put them on the list. If there are helplines you can call, the names and numbers of those organizations and numbers would be there. This is a really valuable counseling tool to send out with someone who's struggling with a lot of hopelessness and sadness and depression. It's a tool, okay? So that's a very practical step that could be taken that I'd be happy to send to you. Then something else is called a hope kit. Since depression, when it's really severe, can involve a significant amount of sense of loss of hope. This came from working with adolescents, but I think it can work with children and adults. So putting things in a little kit, a physical box of some kind, that's a memory aid in times of crisis. So what are things can be put in there, like pictures or memorabilia or something that's pleasurable that I can bring out that's a reminder of when times were better. It's very biblical. The Old Testament says, remember a time, you need to do specific things. God did this, God did this, God did this, and remind yourself of that because you're going to need those during the troubling times. So a hope kit, Bible verses, symbols of the Christian faith, symbols of times when God's been faithful in a way that's just undeniable to you. And have those in a physical thing that you can pull off the shelf that when you sense you're starting to spiral, you can pull that out and have a reminder of the better things, the things that generate hope for the future. So a hope kit is a good practical idea to stop that spiral of negative thinking. Then finally, remember the Lord. When we get overwhelmed by circumstances, we start to lose hope, we get really discouraged, it's easy to have what I call spiritual amnesia. And to forget the way God's been faithful, the way God's worked in your life. So questions would be like, when has God worked in your life in the past? What I call spiritual anchors. You know, those experiences and events where God's done something, God's blessed you in a way that's undeniable, that in the midst of a time of struggle, it's been forgotten. And that might be something, a reminder you'd put in your hope kit. Or pray for that. God, I need some hope. Remind me of a time when. Okay? So the spiritual anchors. But what are the promises God has made to help us get through the present and hope for the future? You know, Revelation 21 and 22 are great reminders. Acts 1, where the angel said, this Jesus went up to heaven, he's going to come back. What's the big picture reminder of the hope? How do we spiritually have anchors from the past in our own lives and hope for the future so that spiritually we regain that sense of hope? Spiritual amnesia, how do we overcome that? So these are various practical ideas. The body, the mind, relationships, our faith. That depending on where you or someone might be struggling, which piece of that is most important at a given time to stop us spiraling into depression and start the process of rebuilding hope and confidence. And depending on the person, the circumstances, there are different pieces of where you may need to start and where you may need to focus. You may need God to really help you overcome some really negative thinking about yourself. Okay? Those core beliefs are part of the challenge because those can get ingrained in a very young age and can be very challenging to overcome. So this is where some self-examination, some reflection, some counsel from others, from people that know you, prayer, all those things together, physical wellness checks, things like that, depending on your particular need, where you start. So, to quote one of the favorite things, one of my favorite quotes from Forrest Gump, that's all I have to say about that. You thought I was going to say something about the candy in a box, right? So this is where I will pause, and now this is the time for whatever's on your mind. And I probably said way more than I should have. That's one of my faults as a former professor.
Awesome. Thank you so much. While we're waiting for cards, let's give Dr. Romig a hand, for sure. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And Chad is going to pick up any questions that y'all may have written down, and give you a couple of seconds to write some down if you're still thinking, ruminating. Yeah, we can go ahead and get started while people are finishing up. And then if you have a card, just raise your hand. Chad or Taylor will come get it from you. Okay, here we go. You ready? And I hope not one of these is not, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? We'll see. Okay, where should we start in research and conversation with a family member or friend who's placing blame for their depression on external factors that do not exist or they are exaggerating?
You probably won't like this answer, but it depends. And it means what I mean by that is, I think in one sense, each person is sort of unique, and you have to know them well enough to get a clue where the various problem points are, back to sort of that complex diagram. Now, could you repeat that question? Because I had a specific piece of that I wanted.
Yeah. Where should we start in research/conversation with a family member or friend who's placing blame for their depression on external factors that do not exist or that they are exaggerating?
Well, this will sound strange, but I wouldn't minimize the external factors. Some people live really hard lives that, for lack of a better description, most of us would find depressing. That's just the reality for some people. As I used to say to some clients, I said, you've been dealt a really bad hand in life. Now, the challenge is, what are you going to do with that? You can take a bad hand and play it the best you can, or you can just sort of give up. But how do you make the best of what you've got? Now, that can sound really insensitive, so you've got to find a way to say that nicely. But emotion, it's hard to talk people out of emotional states. So I think there's value to affirming the emotion. You feel really awful. But then try to find where, this is my cognitive therapy approach, find where the problem thinking lies. And what I hear in that is a struggle to take responsibility and to believe that I have choices and can actually do something about my circumstances. They may be horrible circumstances, horrible life situations, horrible bosses, coworkers. That happens. Family members that are toxic. That may be mostly true. I heard the exaggerated, but it may be mostly true for some people. What can the person do within a bad situation to make choices and make things better? And I think the question I like to ask is, well, what are you doing to keep things from being even worse than they are for you? That's a strange kind of question, but that's a good counseling question, because it implies, as bad as things are, you probably could find ways for them to be even worse, which suggests you at least are keeping the spiral at this level and not letting it get worse. If a person acknowledges that they have enough control over a situation to keep things from getting worse, it also implies they can make it a little better. Or a common counseling question, here's a very practical question. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being life's as good as it could be, and 1 being it's as horrible as it is, where do you put yourself? And if they say I'm at a 1, say, well, what would it take to get from a 1 to, say, a 1.5 or a 2? What would it take to make things just a little bit better for you? Now, that question implies that you actually can maybe make things a little bit better, but not a whole lot better. And what's that first step? Or like the movie What About Bob, which is one of my favorites, baby steps. What's that first step that can get things moving in the right direction? That implies some control. If someone really doesn't want to take any responsibility for control, you've got some deep core belief operating there that basically says, I can't do anything about things in life. And that's the problem then, is how do you change that kind of a core belief?
Well, you'll be
Now-
excited to know we have a lot of questions piling up here, so we probably need to move on from that one.
Okay.
Next one is treating depression like a physical ailment helpful in supporting a loved one going through it?
I think there are clearly some physical causes to depression, and treating as a physical ailment, I think, matters. And that's why I think, I was taught early on to be very, very skeptical of medication approaches. And I've really changed that a lot, including when it comes to depression. I think there can be powerful physiologial factors involved, and as a mood elevator, that can be very helpful. I think it's tricky because a lot of those medications seem to only work short term. I don't have a great deal of knowledge there. So what else does a person need to learn, whether it's change their thinking process, other physical changes they can make, diet, exercise, whatever, to improve their overall physical health, or other treatments, maybe hormones of certain types will work as well or better depending on the cause of the depression than an antidepressant. So I think there are physiological issues that really need attention. I don't think, as an example, I had a friend that was suffering from low T, and he got very depressed. I don't think an antidepressant was going to help a whole lot. He needed hormone therapy. And when he got that, a medical treatment, it improved things significantly for him. But finding the right medication, I think, is key.
Right. Okay. Cool. That's very helpful. Now, do you have practical exercises to stop ruminations?
Notice your body when you're starting to tense up, because ruminations start to do things like affecting your heart rate, your breathing rate, and self-awareness of the body is critical to catching emotions early. And then pause and say, okay, what am I saying to myself here? What is it that's going through my head? That can be very challenging. And that may take some reflection after you're outside of that emotion. Well, what happened? What was I probably saying to myself? And if you can identify that, then learn to catch that, stop that thought. But again, back to your body is a good clue as a starting point to, I must be saying something to myself that's actually feeding this. So again, physical clues is important in that.
Well, now looking at helping others, how do you lead a reluctant person through the antidotes?
A reluctant person, again, it depends on who they are, what's their relationship with you, and what's behind the reluctance. You have to ask yourself, am I the best person? Am I a credible person that I can actually offer some sort of, call it encouragement, feedback, critical feedback if that's what's needed, and it will actually has a chance of being heard and making a difference.
Yeah, and isn't it true as well that it is difficult to help somebody that just does not want help?
Yeah, or doesn't want help from me.
Right, yeah.
Counseling, here's a basic fundamental of counseling that I think may help with that question is, you don't get anywhere with a client if you don't have some basic level of them having trust and confidence in you, that they're willing to listen, that you can suggest all the good ideas possible, but if they don't trust or have confidence in you, it goes right past them. And that's a relationship dynamic issue. So you may not be the best person to try to offer them the feedback that they're willing to hear. So who might it be? In an odd way, now this goes back to early in my career, I worked with a lot of troubled adolescents who never wanted to be in counseling, or very rarely did they come willingly. They were brought in by some adult authority figure, like a parent, that made them come for counseling, or else. I got a lot of court-ordered kids, go to counseling or go to jail, kid. Well, counseling sounds better most of the time. But a lot of these, particularly boys, had tuned out their parents, particularly their fathers. So I try to find who's an adult in your life that if you needed advice, you'd listen to them. And I found a lot of grandfathers that they would listen to and hear the same thing from grandpa or a coach or a youth pastor, the same thing that their father might say that they will totally tune out, but they'll hear it from some other adult authority figure. And particularly when it's a father-son conflict or a mother-daughter. So finding those people, I think, can be also helpful. Yeah. So I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense, especially in this context. Yeah. Reaching out to, again, you said youth pastor, or anybody who's on staff at the church, or even like you said, another family member. It makes a whole lot of sense.
Yeah,
because you don't go it alone.
Because there's a power dynamic involved with with certain family members that it's like, I don't want to listen to you even if it's the right thing. Okay? Yeah. By the way, I realize a lot of these responses are pretty cliched, and I apologize for that. It's hard to get real specific without knowing specific situations. Okay? So I apologize for how general they are.
There are a couple real specific ones in here, but this one is specific to something. I'm not sure if this is a program or a medication. Somebody is wanting to know if you've ever heard of eustress, and it's spelled E-U-S-T-R-E-S-S.
My familiarity with that term is it's from positive psychology research and how stress can actually be, certain kinds of stress can actually be helpful. What's a stress that, say, motivates you to take action? Okay. And so it's like saying there's stress that can be overwhelming and deplete your energy, but there's also certain kinds of stress. Like, for instance, with students, you better have a certain amount of performance anxiety and stress about your upcoming exam, and that motivates you to study. If the stress is overwhelming, where you have test anxiety and you can't even sit down and think straight, that's where the stress becomes overwhelming. And so stress can be good at a certain point to motivate you and energize you, but then it can also become overwhelming and actually interfere with your performance. Yeah. Sports psychologists know that.
So here's a very specific question. This person says, when my young daughter, age 9, for context, spirals, what can I do to help? Do I validate her? Do I try to turn sad stuff to positive stuff? I don't know what to say. I don't want to hurt her more or blow off her feelings, but I also don't want to keep it going by too much validation. When she says things, for example, like, I'm ugly, I don't like my face, I wish I looked like this or that or the other thing.
Well, I had one response to the first part, and then when you added those examples, it threw me a little bit. So give me the first part of that question.
Sure.
Again.
When my young daughter spirals, what can I do to help? Do I validate her, or do I try to turn sad stuff to positive stuff? She basically, the question is, how do you, I think, help someone get out of those negative thoughts, which you actually put the diagram up about, without validating them, but also to encourage the positive thoughts?
Okay. Validate the feeling. That's a basic starting point. You know, you feel really bad right now, and you can put a, basic emotional label: mad, sad, afraid, disgust, and happy. Those are the 5 basic or primary emotions. Now, you'll read other people that disagree with that, but I think there are 5 basic or primary emotions. But validate you're feeling sad or you're feeling worried or afraid. Start with validating the feeling, and that creates a connection. And then I think don't push it. I like to say be present so they know you're there to help. But then a good question to ask is I want to be helpful to you. What can I do that would be helpful? What is it you want or need right now? And then if that's something you can provide. So what you hear in that is validate the feeling, the power of a caring presence. That's a very basic counseling 101. Sitting with clients in silence while they're in pain can be amazingly and powerfully therapeutic for some people without saying a word. But then when you get to words, see, when you're in emotion, you're in kind of one part of the brain is hijacked or flooded, overwhelmed. the other part, words don't tend to get through as well. You can't reason people out of emotion very well. You know, trying to talk people out of anxiety or to cheer people up with depression with words doesn't tend to work until you have that connection and validate the pain or the struggle. Then see if they can articulate what specifically it is that's creating those thoughts. Like you said, those examples there. Where are those coming from? Those specific statements. What are the experiences that are saying I'm ugly or whatever?
Sure. Well, here's a good follow-up question that's very similar. I imagine your answers will be similar as well. This one says, my mom is consistently in a cycle of negative thoughts regarding things that happened to her in the past, such as my cousins never accepted me, I was always bullied by my peers. I never knew why she would ruminate this way and usually suspected she was just seeking negative attention and would blow her off and tell her to let it go. What would actually be a better way to handle this?
Well, I think whoever wrote that, it was very astute. People can learn to use their pain and struggles to actually get what are called secondary gains, like get attention. And age doesn't matter. We all need a certain amount of attention in relationships. So that could be a way to gain attention. But then to me, the question is, why do they need attention and that this mechanism seems to work so well? And if the way I'm responding to those kinds of statements isn't working, stop doing it and do something different. If what you're doing isn't working, stop doing it and try something different. And I think, again, back to validate the feeling. So you had lousy cousins, and you had whatever those other things are. I'm really sorry to hear that. That must have been really hard for you. But then we call it how and wow. Well, given all that, wow, look at all you've been able to accomplish in your life, given you had terrible cousins and all that other stuff that happened to you and how life has been so terrible. How were you able to do all these things as well as you did? That's called a solution-focused approach. But to try to shift from validating the struggles to how are you able to cope with it as well as you have and accomplish what you have done, given those limitations. Because it's possible, probably not, but it's possible. Everything that's being said about the history is true. Maybe exaggerated, maybe not. But even if it is true, how have you managed as well as you have in spite of that? And looking for strengths and capabilities, because that's what is sort of undeniable. I had a terrible past, but I've been able to do this. That kind of discrepancy between, gee, my life was horrible and it should have continued to be horrible, but I was able to do some positive things, I guess I did pretty well.
Well, so here are a couple follow-up questions that kind of complement the train of thought that you're on right now. So there's two of them from two different people. The first is, how can I start to change my thinking if I feel like a failure? And the next question, I think if you answer it, you will also answer that one, which is, what are the self-healing capabilities? And the request was if you could explain that slowly so I can write it down.
All right, I need to hear that whole thing one more time.
Sure.
Because
So
I clue into certain words and my mind goes...
So the first one's, how can I start to change my thinking if I feel like a failure? And the second one was, what are the self-healing capabilities?
Part of the self-healing capability is already there in just being able to say, I have this belief about myself and I want to change it. That's part of it, is identifying, I have this struggle and I know it relates to this belief. Okay? Now, part of the solution, part of the antidote, I don't want to say solution because that sounds bigger than it probably is, but part of that healing process is recognizing and acknowledging I don't have to carry this burden in this way forever. I have been successful in certain kinds of ways in spite of that belief. Let's notice what I have succeeded in doing. And I don't have to be a superstar at anything to be successful. So noticing what has been accomplished in life, not what I wanted to do but didn't, but what I have been able to do, that's part of it. So you have a more balanced way of thinking. It's called a cognitive distortion of maximizing the negative that says I'm a failure and minimizing the positive that's contrary to that belief. But then I think a second harder piece is to actually go back in time, and you may need help from other people from your past, but where did these ideas come from that I'm such a failure? Who put those there? How did they get there? And were they really valid? Was that really about me or about something else? But where did that come from? And who are the people that taught me to think that way about myself?
And of course, seeking counseling will help with that.
Well, I think that's what a good, well-trained, cognitive-oriented therapist would do. There are usually life experiences and people with some sort of authority in life, oftentimes family members, who helped me learn to see myself that way. And then and certain key events in life that didn't go the way I wanted, that linger in my memory and create that rumination. But it's sort of like I need to go back, and I don't like this term because it's a philosophical one, but how do I deconstruct that story that was created back there and realize that was a false or an incomplete story about who I am or who I was back then that I carried forward.
And by the way, just as an aside, I don't know if all of you in here are aware of this, but we as a staff at the church, we do have counselors that we refer to and help with that process. So if anybody does need to seek counseling, we guide you in that process. Yeah. So we do that here. Yeah.
But let me just illustrate with another example. Some people grow up with the belief that you can't trust anybody. And it's based on real life experiences growing up. So you learn that in your younger years, particularly if it's in your family environment, the people you could count on to treat you well and meet your needs. If they didn't, it's easy to develop that belief and generalize it to others. It's a good survival strategy. But that belief makes it awfully hard to be happily married or to have long-term friendships or to get along with coworkers. And it may have been a valid belief at one point in time to survive, but it's now sort of obsolete, that not everybody's like what I grew up with. And so learning to sort of contextualize where that belief came from, I think can be really, really important. Early in my career, I wasn't trained to think this way, but I learned this. I sent a client back who had that kind of belief, and that you ruined the family as a child, as a teenager. You were the bane of the whole family's existence. I said, I want you to do an experiment and find some family members, extended ones that you can trust, and go talk to them and learn more about your family's history and where you fit into it. And she came back, and I remember one of the things she said was, I realized my mom she said, nuts. She had some serious psychological disorders, and nobody ever told me that, and that she couldn't really be the kind of mom I needed, but I thought something was wrong with me. And people told me it was me, but I learned mom from a young age growing up struggled with certain mental illnesses, and she did the best she could, but she just had major struggles. Well, getting that information by doing something very risky, going out and talking to family members and getting more history, it changed how she viewed the family history and herself. And she was better able to take responsibility for her own bad decisions, but to acknowledge, I didn't make myself this way.
Well, here's an interesting one. And I'm going to add a word here that I think will clarify the question. Do dreams in any way, shape, or form relate to our moods?
Wow. That is an interesting question, and the response I'll give you is I really have no idea. As an undergraduate psychology student, I got kind of fascinated with dreams. I had professors that completely discounted their meaning. Different theories have different ways of interpreting dreams, and some of them are rather, in my view, strange interpretations. Just read a little bit of Carl Jung's theory of dreams. So I honestly don't have a good sense of what dreams are, what purpose they serve in our sleep. And so I there are experts on this. I'm not one, but I'm very cautious unless it's one of those biblical, God clearly spoke to me in a dream that's undeniable. I'm not sure how to interpret dreams. And God clearly has spoken to people in dreams. Yeah. That's not an issue, but I don't know what they mean. One theory is they're about wish fulfillment, the things you wish you could accomplish but haven't. Others say they all relate to childhood trauma, experiences, and repressed memories. So I don't have a good theory or explanation for that.
Good answer. Thank you so much for your time. We are about out of time. There's one last card, which I think is really good. So I'm going to throw this out there. And if anybody has any really good ideas of what to put in that hope kit, this person writes, it might be helpful to ask the group to share what kinds of things, verses, for example, they'd put in a hope kit to give us all additional ideas. Now, that is the purpose of this group gathered here today, Caring for the Caregivers, is to give us all ideas. So if anybody has ideas, I'll just open it up now. We'll take just a couple of minutes. If nobody wants to share anything openly to the group, let me encourage you. I know that there's lots of index cards left on the table. Why don't you write those down on the index cards on your table, leave them on the table, and then when we wrap up, you could go around and read the cards on the tables if you're interested. And see what ideas people came up with. Sound good? But anybody have any ideas just right off the top of their head? Music, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
It's not necessarily so much what you put in it, but being aware of what you put in it, because I just like this for one of the kids I work with, but we had to make sure everything was easily replaceable because he would easily have meltdowns, and we initially put in some things that were very sentimental that helped him a few times, but the one time he had a meltdown, he broke things, and that just made the hope kit worse after that. And so just keeping that in mind.
So be aware of what's in it. So music and be aware of what's in it. Good things. Yeah. So again, if you have any other thoughts or ideas, please feel free to write those down on the index cards. We'll leave those out for a little while. Before we close for the evening, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. And I do want to remind you that actually not a reminder, I need to tell you, our faithful Mo Mawatuk is sitting back there at our table ready to take any donations that you would like to give for the foundation. We also have some t-shirts available, which are going fast, and books that Michael Broderick wrote, who is the founder of this foundation. And I do want to let you know that everybody that works with this group is volunteer. So we don't get any proceeds from that. It does go 100%, of course, other than material costs, to supporting the artists that we work with, who we work with because art is a therapy for them. So again,
could I just share something about that, by the way? That is so creative, by the way. When Wayne told me about the organization and I had a chance to see the website, I just thought that this is beautiful. Play therapy is one of the things that I got very interested in working with young children. There are all kinds of creative ways that people can learn to express and heal from their pain. Art therapy is phenomenal. The Menninger Foundation Treatment Center, it used to be in Topeka, Kansas. When I was in Wichita, I spent a lot of time at meetings there and trainings. They had artwork by former patients all over, and it was part of the healing process. It's a beautiful thing that your organization is doing.
Thank you very much. So let's thank Dr. Romig again one more time before we leave. And if y'all don't mind, I will just kind of give a very brief prayer as a benediction, and don't feel like you have to run off. There's plenty of cookies left. Write down your ideas, get a t-shirt, and we'd love to see you at a future function. So let's close in prayer. Lord, we just thank you for everyone here. Thank you for Dr. Romig and his willingness to come speak with us. We pray for everyone who benefits from the foundation, Lord, that we will continue to heal mentally and emotionally, that we might contribute to those who are seeking their own peace, Lord. Thank you for this evening and what it has brought to us. I pray that as we go from here, we might always be mindful that you sit on the throne, nothing we do surprises you, and you are sovereign over all, and we can rest in knowing that. And we thank you for calling us to be a part of your kingdom. May our words and our deeds bring you the honor and the glory in Jesus' name. Amen.